War and the fight for our survival has been one of the key defining features of the modern state of Israel. While we as a society yearn for peace, it has so far eluded us. More than any other experience, it defines the nature and identity of Israelis. It shapes the life of every one of our children. At the age of 18, we put them in harm's way, and we force upon them the responsibility to stand there and to protect us and to defend our country. And it influences them and shapes their morality, shapes them psychologically, shapes their sense of the world and their sense of self. But not only does it shape us Israelis. Very often when you ask people around the world to portray, what's your image of Israel? They see a country at war. They see a country fighting. That's the picture. As a result, both for Israelis and for world Jewry, this is one of the most significant issues that we have to think about and that we have to reflect on. And it's going to be a critical feature of our covenant. How do we think about war? How do we think about how one fights a war? What is our morality of war? What's our notion of just and unjust warfare? If war is a core feature, unfortunately, of our existence, is it that which we are ashamed of? Or is it something that we believe we are engaging in and still living up to the highest standards of moral and Jewish value aspirations? The Torah of Israel requires a new chapter. It requires a chapter in which the Jewish people study, reflect, and become experts in the intricate details of morality of war. The Torah of Israel requires of us to add a new chapter. A chapter of how you survive and how you live as a Jew in the midst of the horror of war. I'm sitting here today with Professor Moshe Halbertal. What are the challenges of just war that Israel is facing today?
Well, we are in a new condition of warfare, what is called asymmetrical war. By that we mean we don't have the usual wars that we had. Let's say in Six-Day War, 1973, Yom Kippur, we don't have two armies clashing in a defined front, fighting one against the other. We have an enemy, the Hamas, Hezbollah, that is embedded in the civilian population, that many times, most of the time, doesn't mark itself by wearing uniforms from their civilians. And here we have two challenges, two completely new challenges. First, we have a rule, and this is the basic rule of any just war theory. Any just war, especially for Tzahal, is you don't target non-combatants. That's, even if it might help you in self-defense, this is a murder. The other side is targeting non-combatants. They are shooting indiscriminately into Sderot, into our villages and cities. We, as an army, target only combatants. But first question is, who's a combatant? You don't have people with uniform. You have to move from what I would call wholesale to retail. You have to define, you have to put a uniform on the other side. And our definition, very careful definition, is saying, well, you have to isolate from this environment, this meshed environment, those who belong to the causal chain, whom their intentional actions belong to the causal chain of terror. It's the one who plans, the one who supplies, the one who arms, the one who recruits, the one who drives the suicide bomber, the bomber. You have to isolate that chain and
is there a direct, what about the one who feeds?
Okay, now you have a problem. This is a serious problem. How do you define the chain? You always have serious questions and debates.
Like the factory worker in
the
World War II.
factory worker, the financer. The one who feeds I would say our practices is not part of the chain because he would feed anyhow. He produces food, even if those terrorists would be just
So it's
mere
direct
civilians.
responsibility plus someone whose job has been changed specifically
Exactly.
in order to engage in
And
war.
it's an intentional action. By that, you could have a car driver, even, by the way, sometimes an Israeli, who doesn't know that he's driving a terrorist. He's not a combatant. He might be harmed. We'll get into it soon. He might be collaterally harmed because there is a legitimate target in his car, but he's not a target. So first challenge is, the first serious challenge in this new situation that we're putting a lot of work in, is first of all to define the combatant among the others. For example, if you have terrorists who come into a house to store Katyushas or missiles, the residents of the house are not combatants. Though they might even, they might not oppose the putting of the missiles. But we don't define them as combatants because they didn't fight against the terrorists who brought those missiles in. You have to be very careful with that, because if you work with too large conception of combatants,
Then
you
it
might
becomes
end
irrelevant.
up killing half of Gaza. So first challenge is to define the combatant.
Isn't the definition of terrorism actually where you have too wide a definition, where a civilian population is in fact defined as...
That's what the terrorists.
That's what terrorists do.
Yeah,
a
they
civilian because you support,
Exactly.
or you're the mother of,
Exactly.
or you will become.
Exactly, and that's the primary task in such a situation is say, let's define the combatants when they don't define themselves, when there isn't a uniformed army outside the civilian
That's
population.
challenge one.
That's challenge one. If you want to take a clear example from a problem we have in Kastled, was the police force. We attacked directly the police force. And in usual wars, you don't attack police. Police is not a fighting force. It's
They're
not
civilian.
They're civilians. They don't activate the violence of the state against you. They work the violence of the state against their own citizens.
Or they're like the people preparing the food. They would have been doing that
Exactly.
anyway if there wasn't a
Exactly.
war.
But we claimed that within Hamas, these are combatants who are on the payroll of police. If you look at the sug of the ammunition they carry, etc., etc. But that's a question that comes up. So that's the first question. First question, the first challenge that we do a lot of work in is, let's see how we define a specific and justified targets among this mess. The other issue that comes, that is in some ways deeper and more problematic, is that you know that after you have a legitimate target, let's say he belongs to that chain that we defined, and it's verifiable, you know that hitting that target means collateral killing to the innocent civilians around. And the challenge is, what does it mean? How do we conduct ourselves given that situation? And I want to say one thing which is wrong before starting what ought to be done, is to say the following, which you hear a lot, but you have to be careful not to fall into this trap. You say, look, they are hiding among their civilians. They are shooting at our civilians. We are not responsible for the life of their civilians. This is their issue. The principle embedded in the spirit of the IDF, in its principles of war, is the following: that though they are attacking your civilians, and though they are embedded in their civilians, you have responsibility while attacking them towards the lives of the innocent people around them. It's your responsibility. You cannot say, well, whatever happens to them, it's not my problem.
They created the reality. It's their
Because
moral responsibility.
Because those innocent people who are trapped there are not part of the game. They're not your enemy. And you are engaged, tragically, in sometimes causing their death.
But what would happen if you can't kill them? Right. You're saying we have that responsibility. Okay. So what happens if we can't target without killing?
Okay.
Could they handcuff or shackle us into not being able to respond?
So one thing is the following. We understand that there will be justified collateral killing. But there are two very important...
There is justified collateral killing.
There is. Because if not, then you cannot fight the war. The other side
will by definition win.
Exactly.
If they get rid of their moral standards,
Yeah.
then they shackle the moral.
You cannot chain yourself to that. But in order to justify collateral killing, you have to answer two very important conditions. The first one is that you did an effort to minimize the killing. It's not only that you didn't intend it, but you intend for that not to happen actively. For example, you have to warn the civilians to leave. You have to use the type of ammunition that will be far more exact
and accurate.
You have to use as much as intelligence that you have. You have to attack at the time where you think that there will be less collateral killing around. And I would say even more, this is something very important, you have to assume some risks to your own forces in order to minimize collateral killing of civilians. And that's a question that comes up again and again. Let's take an example, a very tragic example. You have a home, you have a building, and there is a terrorist there, and he's shooting from there. You can drop a bomb from the air and kill him, but you would know that for certain you will kill quite a lot of civilians with him. So you have to send your soldiers. But sending soldiers, ground forces, that means you're risking your soldiers. But you have to take calculated risks in order to minimize collateral killing. And that's what we did, for example, in Jenin. We had a problem in Jenin at the big operation in the West Bank after the wave of terror. And, you know, Israel could have flattened from the air the refugee camp of Jenin, but that means immense civilian deaths, though they weren't the target of those bombings. But that means immense civilian deaths. And you put in ground forces, and you know you risk your soldiers. So the first principle is the following. Collateral killing is justified given the fact that you have tried, as much as you can, to minimize the scope of that killing.
Now, you call it collateral killing. Normally people call it collateral damage. Is that intentional on your part?
Yes, because it's a killing.
It's a
damage
killing.
means...
And when you call... It's a
yeah, damage means, you know, you collaterally
oops, you
broke a
spilled something.
TV.
You broke it. Yeah. By maintaining the word killing, you maintain... Right.
That's important. And
that
it's something you
critical.
have done. Whatever, you know, you are causing it, tragically. But, and I say, you know, it's not only that I didn't intend to do it. It's I've taken every possible step to minimize it. Not at the expense of the actual completion of the mission.
Like, for example, if you have and there were cases
Right.
where we were targeting heads of Hamas who didn't leave their family setting.
Right.
And decisions were sometimes made not to shoot, and decisions were sometimes made, the famous decision was made to
Right.
shoot, and we killed, what was it, 10 or 15 15 family members.
Right. So
was that a correct decision?
Okay, we'll have to get to the second principle. But before asking whether this is correct decision or not, ask a prior question, which is, did you have a way of killing him without that amount of collateral death? By that means, was there a time of day, a type of ammunition, a tactic of operation that will minimize? And first of all, you have to do what you can minimizing it. That's the first principle. And this is very important. And that a principle that is basically an expression of the fact that you see yourself responsible, actively responsible, to the innocent people that are around your target.
That you call it killing.
Exactly.
Okay.
The second aspect of this issue is, and here we come to a very problematic issue, is what we call a measure of proportionality. By that we mean the following. Let's assume that your target is legit, right? You have a legitimate target here. Let's assume that you try as much as you can to minimize the collateral killing. Now you have to ask yourself a second question. Is the expected collateral death that you're causing proportionate to the military advantage that you got? I'll give you an example. We, for example, know that in a certain neighborhood in Nablus there is a terrorist. We don't know exactly where, but we have good information that there is. And then you can say to yourself, well, I don't know where he is. I'm targeting him. I'm dropping bombs all over the neighborhood in order to kill him. 5,000 people that died with him, these are collateral deaths. And then you would say, no. The proportion is wrong here, because the sort of risk that that particular terrorist caused to you doesn't justify 5,000 civilian deaths.
Moshe, I want to ask you a question. When you take this, look at this argument,
Right.
I could see somebody outside, not the military commander who has to make the decision, who has no choice.
Right.
But I see someone on the outside looking at this concept and says, you're playing. You gave me 5,000. 15. How am I supposed to
good.
measure? Here it is. I have one terrorist, 15.
Okay.
Then I have a calculation. One second. Are they children? Are you able to give me the exact? Is this science? Are you
No,
claiming it's
not at
science?
all.
And if
Not
it's
at
not
all.
science, are you?
Not at all.
How do you do morality? Because
think-
you're making it sound as if
I'm
it's so
talking
clear.
about limits. I don't have actually clear. I gave you a clear example, and you rightfully said that's too clear. But these things happen. And what we ask our commanders and soldiers and ourselves is to say, we're not going to give you a rate, an exchange rate. We'd say, well, the exchange rate is you kill 5 of them to save 2 of us, something like that, collaterally. I mean, if they're terrorists, you kill all of them to save only 1. Now we're talking about innocent people.
And we're talking about a tradition which says whoever saves one life, it's if you save the whole world. So
Exactly.
the whole notion of a calculation for life is antithetical to our
So
tradition.
the last thing we would do is establish an exchange rate. And this is a matter of discretion, and there is a room for discretion. But at least you have to know what is the discretion about.
Do you feel that if you give this discretion, that is it like one of those legal areas where you can come up with whatever conclusion you wanted to in any event?
Not at all.
Except for
Not at
I'm not talking about the extreme cases. The 5,000 is easy. But here it is, I have one person, I did everything in my power. Okay, I calculated. It's like, I want you to, it's killing, shoot, cry, feel bad about it, but shoot anyway. Did this moral exercise, instead of actually helping a moral calculation, actually give a moral stamp to almost anything that you want to do? Could it be used that way?
First of all, if you don't share the conviction of the value, you'll always find a way
Easy.
of legalizing.
You could be a Naval Bershuta Torah,
Exactly.
scoundrel within the realm of the law.
Exactly, absolutely. So you can always play that game. You can say, I tried, this is proportionate. You can, for example, magnify the threat that target posed to you. You can do many games. But we're not talking about law, and we're not talking about a way in which the soldier will come out not criminal under procedures of law. We're talking about the intrinsic values of war. Now, you can see by the total result whether those 2 principles were actually activated, right? For example, you look at certain practices of targeted killings at the start of the war in Afghanistan. And you would say, well, you got 1 terrorist, you killed 400. There's something wrong in it. It's something wrong on 2 aspects. One is, you didn't do enough effort to minimize the death in terms of the level of intelligence, ammunition, etc., etc. There was something sloppy here. Because you said, I want to kill the target. No matter the target is legitimate, whatever will be around is also legitimate. And something about proportionality has to measure. So it's not like everything can be justified.
But let's make this let's bring it into the Israeli reality, which very often makes it even more complicated. And that is that the consequence of the decisions you spoke about, you were one of the authors of the IDF spirit,
Right.
which helped to define what are the moral principles that soldiers have to keep in their pockets,
Right.
keep in their minds and their hearts and on their trigger fingers as they're going to war. And one of the categories that you wrote is the category that the soldier must, and I'm quoting, do everything to the best of their ability.
Right.
The best of their ability to avoid civilian casualties. And there's a big debate in Israel. What's the best of their
Right,
ability?
right.
Now, does the best of their ability also mean endangering the life of our soldiers?
Yeah, it means what I would call calculated risk. It doesn't mean go and send your soldiers to suicide missions in order to minimize the collateral killing. But it means calculated risks. And I want to say something very important. If you come to a commander and say, don't take risks, he will choose the most straightforward, in some ways narrow, brutal way to go about things. Necessity is the mother of invention. And many times, by the way, units who act under the principle of assuming risks to their soldiers, that doesn't mean they will have more deaths among the soldiers. It means that they will be pushed to better training and also to an inventive approach to the problem rather than massive fire on the target. But as far as we understand it, it includes a certain amount of risk to be assumed. I want to say another thing which is very important. Many times those rules are not there in order to prevent an army from victory. Not at all. I think they allow, and this is the most important thing.
In a just war, if the war is a just war, i.e. a war of self-defense, you have a moral right to achieve victory.
And it's noble. It's a noble mission. Those soldiers are doing something very noble. But you want them, and that the line between a patriot and a war criminal is very fine, is very subtle. Those rules are there to help us distinguish between the noble patriot and the war criminal. It's not a small matter. And you have to give the soldiers and the commanders some guidelines about
how to think about
this question.
Now, on this question, very often, the feeling or the defense or the claim is that Israel's held to double standards. That what another army would be able to do on this, as you,
Right.
the calculation that you're describing is a mess.
Sure.
In other words, it's not exact science.
Never, no.
And it's something that a commander has to decide in the midst of battle. He's not
Right.
sitting here,
Right, right.
analyzing and measuring. He might have 2 minutes. Sometimes he has a couple of hours. Sometimes he just has a few
Absolutely.
minutes to make these decisions. And so it's not something where the outcome is fixed, but it's one where there's almost a moral aspiration. But is Israel's army demanded of more than you would demand of other armies? Is it, number one? And number two, is that legitimate? How do we feel as Jews about that? Or how do you feel as a Jewish philosopher about that question?
I would say that those issues really about more ethics of war for us as Jews and Israelis, it's really not about what other people think about us. It's really about ourselves. It's the very legitimacy of what we do and how we do. It's about, as you said in the beginning, our children ourselves. We want them to fight, we want them to come out victorious, and we want them to come out and be capable of looking themselves in the mirror as human beings and as Jews.
We also want them to come out alive.
Absolutely. And I would say those rules are not about them not coming alive or being defeated. A professional, good army, well-trained army, not only that those rules would not fail them, it's actually enable them to direct the fire where it has to be directed. Actually, there is a level that the army becomes more lethal in a good way under those constraints. So these are questions that we don't ask for what other people will say about us. But you're right. I think Israel is held to double standards in these issues. That doesn't mean that we would say, well, look at the Russians, how they acted in Grozny. Look at the American army in Fallujah, just erase this whole neighborhood with artillery. Look at this, look at that. So what? So what? Would that justify us? No. Do we do it for them not to criticize us? No. But it is vital, still, within the context of Israel's standing in the world, for us to explain seriously what we do. And by explaining, I don't mean declaring the slogan, "We are the most moral army in the world." What did you say with that? Nothing. You have to explain what we do here, what are our rules, how do we operate, including where do we fail, because we'll always fail. An honest account. And I think in this honest account, you'll find failures, and you'll find also a serious professional army who thinks about those issues in a way that I would say is more rigorous and serious than what we have seen in other battlefields.
I want to end me with I remember when my son went to war. I said to him, Yitzi, I want you to do me a favor. If you're in doubt, shoot first. Yeah. Come home.
Sure.
And we'll deal with it later.
Sure.
I'm very ambivalent about that. I'm ambivalent even though I feel that I would say the same thing again the next time he went.
Sure.
I don't know what that principle is, but Israel's connection to its army. Now, Israel's one of the few countries that I think it's the only country that I know that seems to have a higher tolerance capacity to civilian casualty deaths than it has to the deaths of its own soldiers. Our soldiers are drafted. The job of the army is to protect it. The army is under pressure to have a casualty-less war.
Sure.
I, as a parent, demand it of the army.
Absolutely.
So where is it? And
that's,
we know this.
That's a very serious question, that moment of your conversation. I would say two things. First of all, as a father, you want to have a trust in their commander that he's not giving him targets to intentionally kill civilians.
Correct.
Right. And you want a trust.
Part of coming home safe.
Exactly.
Is also coming home safe that way.
And if you, God forbid, hear that his commander doesn't give a damn and says, just shoot. We want to show them whom we are. We want to deter them. Just kill everything. You'll be horrified as a father. You also will be horrified as a father when the commander thinks in terms of risks with such meticulous, almost hysterical way that every probable small risk that he sees, he destroys everything. He flattens the whole neighborhood. Because that will show to you that he is not particularly professional. I'm not sure you'll trust him in the battlefield altogether. But most important, and here I would say the following. As a father, clearly that. As a father, you don't want your son even to enter into a ground troop. From the point of view of father, let all Gaza be killed collateral and my son would not be damaged. That's very natural. And also from the perception of the soldier himself. But a state, an army, doesn't act from the point of view of the father. And that's part of the tragic reality of war. Right? And what you say is perfectly understandable. Right. Don't be a hero. Come back. Shoot when in doubt, etc. With the sense, I think you allow yourself to say it because you know that his general is not the Russian officer in Grozny who will tell him not only to, part of our challenge is we want the soldiers to use force for the purpose of the mission only. Right? So if you have to break a door, that doesn't mean you're going to break the TV as well. So when you say that, I think deep there, you allow yourself to say it after you know that there is the spirit of the idea. Right? Which there will be a commander who would not tell them, gather all the children there and shoot them. Will not be a commander who will tell them, just break all the furnitures around so you'll show that you'll be here, that there will be a response. Then you can tell him.
Then I can have the luxury of making that statement.
And in some ways, we allow that for you to have that luxury.
Horror, terror, those are very often the terms that we use when we talk about war. The challenge is that how do we bring to that which is horrific a moral standard. And it seems sometimes strange. But our challenge as a Jewish army is precisely at that moment. Precisely when it seems that it's legitimate to forget all other calculations. It's at that moment that we have to think. And that thought process is not going to be simple, and that process is not going to be clean, and it's not going to be exact. But we can't allow the complexity of the reality to free ourselves from having to do the best that we can, the best that is humanly possible, the best that is Jewishly possible, in the midst of this horror and this terror. Moshe, thank you very much.
You're welcome.